Before we dive into this intense and eventful journey, I want to know from you, what would you do if you were in Ricardo's place? The struggle for survival, betrayal, and the fight for freedom are universal themes, but in each situation, our reaction can be unique. If you're ready for a story of courage, overcoming adversity, and mystery, keep reading. And at the end, share your opinion in the comments. How do you think Ricardo should have acted at certain times? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to keep up with all our exciting stories. The clock strikes dawn, a dangerous hour when the empty streets are more menacing than any nightmare. The taxi driver, called Ricardo, a man of ordinary appearance but with a secret past, drives through the city with his car's headlights illuminating the deserted streets. His routine is always the same, but that night, something in the air feels different. He doesn't know it yet, but his life is about to change forever. Meanwhile, members of CJNG, of Mexico's most feared cartels, the Cartel of the United States, carries out a swift and silent operation. They are after information and, to that end, they use brutal methods, not caring who gets in their way. The cartel members don't know that night they are not dealing with a simple taxi driver, but with a Navy informant, Ricardo, a man who, for years, has provided crucial information about the cartel's movements. What they don't realize is that Ricardo's secret is much deeper than they can conceive. The kidnapping, it begins almost routinely, but the tension is palpable. Ricardo, who knows the risks of being discovered, tries to remain calm, but his heart races, sensing that the situation is about to become a nightmare. He can't escape, but he also can't let the cartel discover who he really is. The narrative unfolds as he tries to find a way out alive, while simultaneously dealing with the psychological terror of the moment. The contrast between Ricardo's peaceful life and the brutality of the cartel men becomes increasingly evident. As he tries to find a way out, the situation becomes more complicated, leading him to question his past choices and what the future holds. The Mexican landscape, with its desert scenery and flickering city lights, serves as a backdrop for the dramatic events. Ricardo's neighborhood, it's a quiet place, but marked by the scars of an undeclared war, where violence lurks in the corners and families try to carry on with their lives, even under the weight of fear. Despite being a middle-class area, there's something in the air that everyone feels. The cartel is never far away. Ricardo, a simple 34-year-old man, lives a discreet life. His face is marked by the weariness of the early mornings, but his eyes show a calmness that contrasts with the pressure of his profession. However, he hides something much bigger. Ricardo is, in fact, a Navy informant. He was recruited years ago due to his strategic position as a taxi driver. Knowing the city's corridors like no one else, he began providing information about the cartel's movements. His normal life is a facade, as he lives in constant fear of being discovered and suffering the consequences. The members of CJNG, on the other hand, they are ruthless and calculating. Hector, the leader of the group that kidnaps Ricardo, is a cold and meticulous man with a bloody past within the organization. He is known for his efficiency and ability to eliminate any threat without hesitation. Alongside him are Carlos and Luis, two equally dangerous men, but with different temperaments. Carlos is impulsive, making quick and often risky decisions, while Luis prefers a quieter approach, investigating every detail before acting. Their relationship with the world around them is one of pure exploitation. They have no ties to the community. Their only loyalty is to the cartel, and their code of honor is simple: to dominate or destroy. Their presence on the streets is constant and intimidating, and Ricardo knows this better than anyone. However, he still believes he can use his knowledge to get out of this situation alive. He has a plan, but to carry it out, he needs to buy time. As the kidnapping progresses, details about Ricardo's personal life begin to emerge. He has a wife, Isabel, who knows about his secret mission, is afraid of losing her husband. The couple lives with the weight of the lie, unable to share Ricardo's reality with anyone. Isabel, even though suspicious of what is happening in her marriage, has faith that Ricardo's situation will be resolved soon. She has no idea that the truth is closer to her doorstep than she ever imagined. The cartel, in turn, sees Ricardo as a pawn in its power game, but is completely unaware of his importance to the Navy. Hector. He believes he's dealing with a simple taxi driver who happened to cross his path, without realizing he's about to face someone who knows his moves and is willing to fight to the end. As the kidnapping drags on into the early hours of the morning, the tension only increases. Members of CJNG, they are keeping Ricardo captive, taking him to an isolated location far from the busy streets of his city. They know he is an informant, but for now, they are unsure to what extent he possesses information that could compromise their operation. With each passing hour, the eyes of Hector and his men become more suspicious. The pressure on Ricardo only increases. Ricardo tries to remain calm, but his mind is racing. He knows that if the cartel discovers his true identity, it will be the end. His only recourse now is time, and he needs an opportunity to turn the situation in his favor. Hector, he already suspects that Ricardo is not just an ordinary taxi driver, but an informant. He decides to put Ricardo to the test, trying to extract a confession from him about what he knows. The interrogations begin. Each member of the cartel takes a different approach. Carlos, impatient and aggressive, he tries to intimidate Ricardo with physical threats. Luis, the more calculating one, seeks a more psychological approach, trying to manipulate Ricardo's mind with words, creating doubts and insecurities. But Ricardo, although tormented by fear, remains firm. He cannot reveal anything. The tension grows with each passing moment. Ricardo feels the psychological pressure mounting, but an idea begins to form in his mind. He needs to play their game. If the cartel men want answers, he must partially surrender, creating a smokescreen that leads them to believe he really is the simple taxi driver he appears to be. The plan is risky, but there is no choice. He begins to behave in a submissive manner, trying to buy time and gather information that might help him escape. About that, Isabel, Ricardo's wife, begins to despair. She doesn't know where he is, but she senses that something is wrong. The two had said goodbye with a kiss the night before, but she knew he had something to hide. He had always loved her, but the growing tension in their lives seemed to suggest that he was pulling away, and now she finds herself surrounded by a deadly silence, unsure if she will ever see her husband again. Isabel's internal conflict begins to mirror Ricardo's situation, the struggle for survival and the pressure of a secret that could destroy them. The cartel men start to put more pressure on him, but Ricardo manages to maintain his disguise. When he receives the order to transfer him to another, more isolated location, he feels the situation is becoming even more desperate. However, Ricardo begins to realize that perhaps the opportunity to escape is closer than he imagined. The pickup truck carrying Ricardo continued along a dirt road, moving further and further away from the city lights. The engine roared heavily as the men of CJNG, they remained silent, alert to their surroundings. Ricardo, with his hands tied and a dark bag partially covering his face, felt each jolt as if it were a warning from fate. The decisive moment was approaching. Hector, sitting in the front seat, finally broke the silence. "When we get there, we'll find out who you really are, taxi driver." The phrase echoed in Ricardo's mind. When we get there. There was a new destination, a place he didn't yet know, and where his chances of survival would drastically decrease. Panic almost overwhelmed him, but he fought against it. Breathe, control, observe. There was still a chance. There always was. The pickup truck stopped abruptly. The sound of metal gates opening could be heard. The vehicle moved forward and parked. Ricardo was dragged out, still unable to see completely. The air was cooler, unlike the stifling heat of the city. They were in some kind of abandoned property, perhaps a remote farm or a warehouse. When they removed the bag from his head, the scene was revealed. A large warehouse with a high ceiling, peeling walls, and a concrete floor. Armed mobsters moved like shadows, vigilant awaiting orders. But among them all, someone caught his attention. Seated in a chair, chained, he was Santiago, another taxi driver from the taxi rank where Ricardo worked. A quiet, middle-aged man with whom Ricardo always talked about football and family. Now he looked devastated. Bruises on his face, split lips, heavy breathing. Ricardo felt a shock run through his body. They arrested him because of me. Hector noticed her reaction and smiled, pleased. You recognize him, right? She asked. He tried to run when we saw you two talking. Do you think it's a coincidence that two taxi drivers were driving together in the middle of the night? I don't think so. Ricardo swallowed hard. The turnaround was beginning. Hector approached Santiago and lifted his chin, forcing him to look at Ricardo. Your friend here said some interesting things. Santiago tried to speak, but he could barely move his lips. Ricardo. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. Ricardo felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. Was Santiago talking? Had he revealed something? Or was he being forced to repeat lies? It didn't matter. The cartel would believe what it wanted to believe. Hector stepped forward, facing Ricardo directly. He said you were afraid, that you always take different routes, that sometimes you disappear for hours, that you're not just a taxi driver. And do you know what that means to me? A deathly silence fell over the warehouse. That means you work for someone, and I want to know who. Ricardo's blood ran cold. He needed to act. He needed to think fast. He needed to turn that disadvantage into a move. But before she could answer, something unexpected happened. One of the men's radios made a crackling sound. Team 2 calling. Strange activity on the highway. Navy patrols spotted 5 kilometers to the north. The message had an immediate impact. All the cartel members exchanged tense glances. Hector frowned, taking a few steps back, absorbing the information. Ricardo felt his heart race. They were close. They were coming. But would that be a good thing? Or would it mean the cartel would speed up its execution? Hector turned abruptly, now with a completely different expression. Who warned us? Who reported our displacement? He asked, his voice deep and almost trembling. The men fell silent. Some looked at Ricardo, others at Santiago. It was the spark Ricardo needed. He took a deep breath and began to tremble, feigning extreme fear. I heard you talking in the car. You didn't turn off the radio. It wasn't me. I'm just a taxi driver. I heard you were going to change your route. Maybe someone from the cartel is passing on information. It was risky, very risky, but it sowed doubt, and doubt was pure poison for organizations like that one. Hector stared at him for several long seconds, then he looked at his own men. It was clear there was internal distrust. And now Ricardo had ignited that fire. Listen, said Hector, addressing everyone. No one speaks to anyone until I find out who opened their mouth. He then pointed to Ricardo. And you are going to help me with this. Ricardo didn't understand immediately, but then another man appeared through the side door carrying a black briefcase. Hector continued. You're going to tell us which one offered you money, which one asked for information about us, who tried to make you our enemy. He smiled. Let's see who dies first, you or the traitor. The turnaround was brutal. Ricardo, the hostage, would now be used to accuse someone within the cartel, and if he did it the right way, he could create such great internal chaos that he would have a chance to escape. It was risky, almost suicidal, but it was the only opening that had appeared since his kidnapping, and he was going to use it. The silence inside the warehouse seemed to have a physical weight. After Hector's sudden decision, the CJNG men stared at each other with suspicion. The air smelled of tension, sweat, and gunpowder. Ricardo felt his throat dry, but maintained the posture of someone in a panic, something that could now work in his favor. Hector gave quick orders. "Separate everyone! No one speaks to anyone. I want all weapons searched, everything." The men began to move nervously. Some tried to appear overly calm. Others stared at the ground, as if afraid to say anything that would put them in a line of fire. The cartel was cracking, and Ricardo knew. He was the one who opened the first fissure. On the left side of the warehouse, Santiago remained imprisoned, still very weak. Ricardo felt a deep pang of guilt. It had never been his intention to involve an innocent person. But now, recognizing the gravity of the situation, he knew he couldn't try to save him directly. Not yet. Doing so rashly would mean death for both of them. Hector turned his attention to Ricardo, approaching slowly, always with that cold smile. "All right, taxi driver. You said you overheard conversations, that you found some behaviors strange. Let's start there." The men positioned themselves around, forming a sort of circle. Ricardo took a deep breath. The game was about to begin, and every sentence could mean the difference between survival and execution. Ricardo began, his voice trembling. "I don't know names. I don't know anything. But one of them asked me about police routes." Hector raised an eyebrow. "Which one?" Ricardo looked around, not to accuse anyone directly, but to observe reactions. It was a trick he had learned during his training with the feds. Whoever reacts before the accusation is made is always more suspicious. There was a slight movement. One of the men, thin, with a scar on his neck, quickly looked away, as if he didn't want to be noticed. Another, more robust, took an involuntary step back. Ricardo realized there was fear there. And where there is fear, there is opportunity. I'm not sure, but Ricardo hesitated on purpose, creating tension. All eyes turned to him. "I think it was one of the two who were behind me in the pickup truck," he said. The two men exchanged immediate glances. That was all Hector needed to see. "Very good," he murmured. He pointed to the two of them. "You two, get out. Now." The men protested. "But boss, that's absurd. He's just a taxi driver." "Get out!" shouted Hector, his voice thick with unstable fury. They obeyed, walking to the outside of the shed while Hector signaled for two other armed men to follow. Ricardo knew that this could end in immediate execution, and he also knew that he was pressing the fuse of a bomb. As soon as the three left, muffled shouts were heard. One of them tried to argue, but was abruptly interrupted. Panic spread through the warehouse. Some men exchanged suspicious glances. Others discreetly moved away from Ricardo, as if they feared being associated with him. Paranoia had taken hold, and that was exactly what Ricardo needed. Hector returned a few minutes later, breathing heavily, with beads of sweat running down his forehead. He spoke softly, as if trying to maintain control, but his eyes betrayed him. He was on the verge of losing his leadership position. "Now let's continue," he said, looking Ricardo directly in the eye. "Who else spoke to you?" Ricardo decided to take a bit more of a risk. "No, nobody else. But I heard you talking about the change of route. Maybe one of you accidentally sent that information to the Navy. Someone mentioned it on the radio." Hector looked at the men's radios. At that moment, two of them turned off their devices simultaneously. This detail did not go unnoticed. Hector exploded. "Why did you just hang up? Who told you to?" The atmosphere became unbearable. Ricardo felt he had planted exactly the kind of distrust that would destroy the group from within. Now, each member viewed the other as a potential traitor. That was it. Chaos, disorder, fear, everything he needed to buy time. Suddenly, a new noise filled the shed. Helicopters. In the distance, the sound was unmistakable. The men scrambled to grab weapons, some seeking cover. Desperation took hold. Hector shouted, "Everyone to your positions! No one enters without my permission!" He ran to the side door to look outside. Panic pulsed in his face. Ricardo felt his heart race. The Navy was close, very close, but this also meant that the cartel could try to eliminate him before they were overtaken. It was a race against time. He looked at Santiago. His friend could barely keep his eyes open. "I can't leave you here." That's what Ricardo thought. He needed to find a way to free him, even if it was madness. But before he could act, Hector came running back and gave another brutal order. "Let's evacuate! But first, kill them both!" Two armed men approached Ricardo and Santiago. Everything was about to collapse, or about to change for good. The sound of helicopters flying overhead echoed like a final warning. The atmosphere of chaos and despair became palpable, and Ricardo, lying on the floor with his hands tied, felt that every second was crucial. The cartel was about to spring into action, but he also knew that his only chance of survival lay in his own control of the situation, something that had seemed impossible just minutes before. Hector ordered the evacuation, but as his men rushed to the vehicles and prepared to leave, Ricardo realized something crucial. He was in the eye of the storm, but now he had a chance to cause a final turnaround. Panic had taken hold, and distrust was visible in each of the cartel members. Ricardo was no longer just a simple taxi driver, a man submissive to the orders of Hector and his henchmen. He knew that if he made the wrong choices, he would be killed right there. However, he also knew that this was the moment when his survival depended on quick decisions and bold moves. Time was running out. With the cartel men now scattered and weapons in hand, the tension was about to explode. It was clear to Ricardo that, to get out of there alive, he would have to use what he knew. He knew about the cartel's plans. He knew how its members reacted to pressure, and now he would use that information to his advantage. Looking at Santiago, who could barely breathe and was on the verge of unconsciousness, Ricardo realized that he couldn't wait for outside intervention. The Navy might be on its way, but they wouldn't save him in time. He was the only person who could save Santiago. With tremendous effort, Ricardo strained his arms and, aided by the emotional tension coursing through his veins, managed to tear the ropes that bound him. He felt the pain in his wrists, but the adrenaline made him ignore it. Once free, he crawled to Santiago's side, trying not to be seen. The feeling of powerlessness that Ricardo had felt until then began to dissipate. He was no longer the victim. He was the architect of their own destiny. No matter what happened next, he would take control of the situation. Ricardo glanced at the door of the shed, where some of Hector's men were organizing themselves. They were distracted, nervous, and more interested in the sound of the helicopters than in maintaining complete control of the situation. Internal distrust was at its peak. Ricardo didn't hesitate any longer. Quickly, he picked up the small penknife he had dropped on the floor and cut the chains that bound Santiago to the chair. The man, with difficulty, stood up, still staggering in pain, but now free. "Come on! Quick!" whispered Ricardo, pulling Santiago towards the side exit of the warehouse. Time was passing quickly, and the cartel's movements were becoming increasingly frantic. They knew the authorities were closing in, and Ricardo realized that chaos would be his best ally. He guided Santiago with difficulty, but adrenaline and the instinct for survival were stronger than fear. Now they needed to escape while they still could. When they got outside, the sound of the helicopters was already deafening. But there was something else. Ricardo could hear shouts and orders being given by the cartel members. It was clear. Panic had spread like wildfire. Ricardo and Santiago hid behind an old truck, waiting for the right moment to run. With each passing minute, the danger increased. But now Ricardo was in a state of clarity he had never experienced before. He knew what to do. The moment the cartel men got distracted, they would run into the nearby forest. All Ricardo needed was to find an escape route, a place where he could call for help. But there was a problem. Hector, the cartel leader still vying for control, approached with two of his men. The search for traitors and the internal chaos were evident, and Hector wouldn't notice Ricardo and Santiago's escape until it was too late. Ricardo realized that his only chance of escape now was to create a definitive distraction. When Hector and his men were just a few meters away, Ricardo took advantage of the sound of the helicopter and with a shout ran in the opposite direction, creating an unexpected movement. Hector's men, still reeling from the internal crisis, were unable to react in time. Ricardo and Santiago darted into the forest. The sound of gunfire echoed behind them, but no one followed directly. Panic had gripped the scene, and the men were more concerned with saving their own skins. Finally, distance was created between them and the immediate danger. Ricardo had overcome his greatest fear, the feeling of powerlessness. Now he was no longer just an informant or a simple taxi driver. He had become a man capable of fighting for his life and for others, even when all seemed lost. The sun was beginning to rise, tinging the sky with an orange hue. The forest surrounding Ricardo and Santiago seemed immense and undisturbed, but for them, every shadow seemed to hide a new danger. The race for survival had become a matter of minutes. The plan Ricardo had devised was beginning to bear fruit, but he knew the worst was yet to come. The helicopters continued to fly overhead, cutting through the sky with an almost deafening intensity. The Navy was closer than ever, but the cartel also knew there wasn't much time left. If they didn't act quickly, they would lose control of the situation. Patrols were surrounding the area, and the desperate CJNG forces were beginning to reorganize. Ricardo and Santiago were hiding in a small cave that, despite being a temporary refuge, still posed a risk. The entrance was partially covered by vegetation, but no one knew how long this would protect them. The lack of resources, hunger, and exhaustion began to take their toll. Santiago was visibly weakened, and the pressure on Ricardo increased with each passing second. Ricardo approached Santiago, who was trying to rest against the rock wall. "We need to stay calm. If we can survive until dawn, we'll have a chance," said Ricardo, trying to sound confident, even though he knew the situation was much more tense than he wanted to admit. Santiago looked at him with tired eyes, but his gaze still reflected a glimmer of hope. He knew Ricardo was the only person capable of keeping them alive, and now they depended on a single objective: to escape before the cartel caught up with them. Ricardo, for his part, knew he couldn't passively wait for the Navy to arrive. The battle would be fought on two fronts: the cartel trying to end their lives, and the pressure from the approaching military forces. The helicopters and police cars were getting closer by the minute, and they needed to act quickly to ensure that neither side found them before they were ready to flee. Suddenly, a noise came from outside. It wasn't the sound of helicopters, but something different: light footsteps, as if someone were approaching. Ricardo stuck his head out of the cave and could see a silhouette in the distance. Were they cartel members? Or had the Navy finally arrived? Without time to hesitate, he signaled for Santiago to duck, trying to minimize their visibility as much as possible. The sound of footsteps continued, but now it was much closer. It was a matter of life or death, and Ricardo knew that the only chance of survival was to ensure that the cartel never knew they were so close to escaping. Now, the time to act had arrived. Ricardo needed a distraction, something that would allow him and Santiago to move forward. The exit through the forest was closed, blocked by patrols. There was only one viable route: a small road leading to a nearby village where the Navy might be closer. Ricardo made a risky choice. He stood up silently and motioned for Santiago to remain still. His heart pounding, he ran in the opposite direction from the sound of the footsteps. He knew that if he succeeded, he could create a crucial distraction, drawing the cartel members away from the cave. As he ran, his mind raced. With each step, he considered his options. He no longer had time to hide or wait for outside help. The escape had to be immediate, and any mistake now could be fatal. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps grew louder. Ricardo sensed a presence behind him, and before he could turn around, a shadow appeared in front of him. "You're not going anywhere, Ricardo." Hector's voice, low and menacing, rang out in the darkness. Ricardo stopped instantly. He was completely taken aback. They had found him. For a second he felt the weight of defeat, but instead of despair, a cold, calculating feeling took hold of him. The final moment was at hand, and he needed to act quickly. It was now or never. The air was thick. The smell of wet earth, mixed with helicopter smoke, made the atmosphere even more suffocating. Ricardo stood facing Hector, who was approaching slowly, his expression filled with anger and distrust. "Do you think you can escape, Ricardo?" Hector's voice was low but full of threats. "No one escapes the CJNG." Ricardo felt the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Fear no longer controlled him. He had already broken free from his chains. Now it was time to break free from his mental prison, from his former life of submission. He knew he wouldn't have another chance. If he wanted to survive, he would need to use everything he had learned in the last few days: manipulation, observation, patience. He looked into Hector's eyes. There was no more fear, only a cold clarity. "You're mistaken, Hector. The only one who won't get away with it here is you." Hector laughed, but it wasn't a genuine laugh. It was a tense laugh, as if he were more nervous than he wanted to admit. "Are you challenging me, Ricardo?" he shouted, his anger overflowing. But Ricardo was already prepared. He hadn't just run to escape. He had created a distraction. The sound of distant footsteps, the shadows of approaching patrols. It was all part of his plan. Before Hector could react, Ricardo threw himself to the side, rolling swiftly across the ground. He wasn't alone in the dark night. The Navy had already arrived. The sound of heavy boots echoed through the forest as the soldiers in their relentless pursuit advanced. Hector shouted orders, but chaos reigned. The cartel, with its empire of fear, was being overtaken by disorder. CJNG members began to scatter, while others threw themselves to the ground for protection, realizing that the Navy had surrounded them. Ricardo saw his opportunity. Taking advantage of the element of surprise, he ran without looking back. He knew that if he could cross the forest and reach the road, he could be rescued. Santiago, still staggering, was behind him, following with what remained of his strength. With each step, the sound of gunfire echoed in the background. The cartel men were in shock, but they wouldn't give up so easily. Hector, furious, fired into the sky. "They won't escape!" he shouted, his voice tinged with anger and despair. But chaos had already ensued. The Navy advanced and the soldiers began to clean up the area. Hector's every move was being monitored. He was a man who held power, but now that power was shattered. Ricardo and Santiago were now just a few meters from the road, which seemed to be their only chance. Escape was within reach, but the internal battle was not over. Suddenly, the sound of a vehicle approaching. The powerful engine cut through the silence of the early morning, and soon the headlights illuminated the path ahead of them. It was the Navy. The platoon captain, recognizing Ricardo and Santiago, quickly signaled for them to approach. "You are free, but we need to leave now." The captain's authoritative voice cut through the air. Ricardo, exhausted but determined, nodded. He and Santiago climbed into the Navy's armored vehicle, while the soldiers positioned themselves to protect the area. Hector, amidst the confusion, was still trying to organize his men, but it was too late. The siege was complete. The Navy forces had total control. The last image Ricardo had before leaving was of Hector, furious, trying to resist, but knowing that his empire of violence and power had come to an end. Ricardo didn't have time to feel relief. The fear, the tension, the weight of the battle, it was all still there. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing he did know: he had survived. And more than that, he had changed. The fight for his life, the betrayal, the manipulation, the distrust, all of that had transformed him into someone different. He was no longer the victim. Ricardo and Santiago's escape was only the beginning of a new journey. The Navy had rescued them, but their story with the CJNG was far from over. However, at that moment, in the silence of the early morning, with the sounds of battle echoing behind him, Ricardo knew that no matter how long the war continued, he had finally won his own internal battle. Ricardo and Santiago were now safe, but the price of survival was never cheap. Inside the Navy armored vehicle, as the horizon dawned, a sense of relief lingered. It was as if, for a brief moment, the weight of the world had been lifted from their shoulders. But even with safety in sight, something inside Ricardo didn't seem complete. He had escaped death, but the inner struggle continued. Santiago, beside him, struggled to keep his eyes open. His body was exhausted, his mind still reeling from the traumatic experience. Ricardo looked at him, a man who, however weakened, had survived the same nightmare. It wasn't just a matter of physical escape, it was the emotional overcoming of everything they had faced together. "We'll make it, Santiago. We're almost there," Ricardo said with a confident tone, although he knew the future was still uncertain. Santiago, still weak, forced a smile. You saved me. I'll never forget that." Ricardo gave a slight nod, but inside, he felt that somehow they had both been saved. Something deeper was happening there, a connection forged in the fire of adversity. Over the following days, as they moved away from the jungle and closer to a safer place, Ricardo reflected on everything that had happened. He was no longer the same man who had entered that shed, a simple taxi driver who found himself in the wrong place at the wrong time. Survival had not been a matter of luck, but of difficult decisions, of trusting his instincts, and of knowing that, in a war like that, the mind was as powerful as any weapon. He knew that CJNG wouldn't give up so easily. Hector, with his arrogance and control, would still be a threat, but at this moment, Ricardo felt something new. The freedom he had gained was more than just physical escape. It was the freedom to be who he truly was, without the chains of fear and submission. Ricardo didn't know where his journey would take him now. The Navy had fulfilled its role, but Santiago's fate, and his own, were more complex than any rescue could resolve. The cartel still lingered, but now something within Ricardo made him stronger than before. He knew the battle was over, but the war somehow was still to come. As the Navy vehicle continued its route, he looked out the window. The sun was rising on the horizon, and for the first time, he believed he could control his own destiny. The worst was over. Now, the future was in their hands. Months had passed since the rescue, and Ricardo had settled in a quiet town, far from the shadows of the CJNG. The peace he now experienced seemed fragile, but still, it was something he had never imagined achieving. Santiago, recovered, and with his life restarted, kept in touch with him, but both knew that their war had left deep scars that could not be easily erased. Ricardo now looked to the future with new eyes. The fight for survival had been won, but somewhere deep in his mind he knew the cartel would never forget his name, and he would also not forget the most important lesson of all. Fear can be an enemy, but it can also be the force that transforms you. If you've made it this far, you know how Ricardo's journey has been full of twists and turns, challenges and moments of overcoming adversity. But his story isn't just about survival, it's about the power of transformation, courage, and the fight for freedom, even when all seems lost. Did you enjoy the story? What do you think Ricardo and Santiago will do next? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next exciting stories. Your opinion is essential.